It's been such a pleasure after an amazingly challenging year. I think I can speak for many of us here on campus. It was a year of not being able to plan ahead, right? Very much at all, and every little detail had to be rearranged. And being asked to provide a retrospective on the Botanic Gardens over the years, it was just what I needed right at this point to get my head back out from those details and think broadly about what the Botanic Gardens have meant for Wellesley and how they've been connected to the rest of the liberal arts experience at this residential college, right? So there's a big story there, and there's lots of sub stories within that story. So I'm just going to provide an overview, um, keeping in mind that I'm a scientist and not an historian. Um, and this is a first step, right? Wellesley's soon going to have its, I think it's called the sesquicentennial, right? 150 years of Wellesley College. And at about the same time, the Botanic Gardens will be 100 years old. And so I'm going to be working on, and this is the first step towards a project really trying to highlight and understand that history and understand what that means for us going forwards, how we can build on some amazing legacies that we have. So I'm going to take you through my understanding of the college's history of botany, um, just really, again, with highlights through the years. And then it's not going to be anywhere near the 90 minutes, right? And then we'll save quite a bit of time. I would love to hear from you all of your recollections of botany at Wellesley, through email or as we have time afterwards. All right. So I am joined in this endeavor by Gail Kahn, who will be, I think of her as sort of the historian in chief. She's the assistant director of the Botanic Gardens. She has been in that role for 10 years and she's been the manager of the Friends of the Botanic Gardens and the Botanical Art Program, and really kept us grounded and public facing, as well as my focus has been more internally focused. Um, so thank you to Gail. And here we go. So this photo is from 1918, World War One. These are the farmerettes, and they were quite the crew. So this is Margaret Ferguson. There were some amazing, fierce leaders of botany at Wellesley over the years, and the visionary that I keep coming back to over and over and over again is Margaret Ferguson. Um, so she led everything from the intensive science of botany, and Wellesley was well known for providing hands-on science opportunities, right, and hands-on art opportunities. It was very much a let's let these women get their hands on whatever it is and do the science, do the art, and learn by doing. And here you go, learn by doing and also producing, in the case of the farmerettes. So botany started strong, right? The Durants, the founders of the college, were really into botany. They were plant enthusiasts. They had their own greenhouses right near where the college club is now. A wonderful plant collection that they let students in to see, but not necessarily to study. Um, Henry Durant apparently had a dream of a school of botany on the hill, and he was thinking of the hill where actually I'm right at this moment. So botany's been strong since the beginning, and it had these practical aspects, but it moved around, right? There was the College Hall fire, there was the Durant's personal greenhouses, which when Pauline Durant passed away in 1917, they started to go into disrepair. There was a lot of, botany is a thing, but it's all over the place. And Margaret Ferguson did an amazing job of summarizing the first 50 years of botany at Wellesley in this article for the Alumni Quarterly in 1925. And she was in the midst of a big push through the trustees and fundraising and everything else to create the greenhouses that later took her name, and also to set aside 24 acres right on campus for gardens with an educational focus. Right, so this is the center that she's talking about in this quote, and I don't know what kind of screen you're viewing this on, so I'll go ahead and read it for you. Part of this article in which she describes these fabulous new greenhouses in some length and also the plans for the outdoor gardens. Near the end, she says, "It is our purpose that the department shall stand primarily for the dignity and educational value of its scientific work. At the same time, we shall not fail to emphasize the humanistic aspects of our subject, and we shall endeavor to create a center that shall be of interest to all." So she said many things in this article that resonate today, but that one, it just shows how central she saw botany and plants to the liberal arts experience, and that she never saw the Botanic Gardens as this sort of corner of campus, that was its own little thing. It was absolutely connected um, to the rest of what was happening on campus. And this is, I mean, I have college age kids now, and I've toured a lot of campuses, and it's extremely rare to have gardens for educational purposes right there on the main campus. Students can, as you probably know, you can walk through your experiments on your way to class because it's right there. So lots of visionary things from Margaret Ferguson. So she had made a plan, right? Over the decades of kind of moving around, she made a plan that she outlines very nicely in this document. And here are the greenhouses that were built in the early 1920s, so really 100 years ago. You can see they've got beautiful curved glass. They're sort of Victorian style, um, and there's this main axis. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's the tall one in the middle is called the Tropic House, right? And there were other collections houses on either side of it, and then this range that's connecting to this small building, which is kind of the head house. Um, those were the research houses, right? So there were the collections houses with plants from around the world, and then there were the research and experimentation houses. And there's no science center yet, no Sage Hall, no botany labs, nothing yet, just this little head house building. But that was coming because a key part of these laboratories under glass, as she called them, was that they be connected directly to laboratories with full instrumentation. So here, later in the 20s, you can see Sage Hall is a different angle on the same greenhouses. So the greenhouses are now connected with the laboratory, we call them the fingers, connecting directly into Sage Hall, the botany end, bow end of the Bozo or Botany Zoology Hall. And one of the things that Margaret Ferguson was especially proud of is that there were these very, you can see they're sort of blasting the photo here, these lights that would extend the day length. And this was a big triumph in the 1920s to be able to extend the length of the day. They could get 3 generations of petunias, for example, if they were studying breeding and genetics of petunias. They could do 3 generations within an academic year, which is pretty amazing. And she makes lots of statements like there's no better greenhouses anywhere at any college in the country than what we have at Wellesley. She was very proud of these resources. Here's the Tropic House, 1936. You can see some of those same plants, that big leaf right here that this student is examining. That's a cycad that is still with us today in the new greenhouses. Not sure I can say the same for some of these other plants, but many of them are long-lived, and this is part of what we call the permanent collections, right? The diversity of plants from around the world. And there's also the outdoor gardens, right? So there were many options for what to do for outdoor gardens. Our campus, of course, as I'm sure you remember, is extremely hilly, right? That topography really would make it very challenging to do a formal, symmetric, geometric, lots of straight lines kind of garden, which, was the fashion in the 1920s in many places. Instead, this is a completely artificial stream. They call this the cascade where it begins, but it's put in just a spot within that topography where you might expect that stream to run. So there's this very naturalistic approach to creating these outdoor gardens. Um, and Professor Helen Davis in the botany department had training in landscape design. And she sort of brought this English picturesque style to the planning for in this case, the Alexandra Botanic Garden. Here's the construction of that stream, in case no, you know, it was definitely not there on its own. This is a couple of decades later, 1949. So just you can kind of situate yourself. You can see the academic quad and Galen Stone Tower. That would be Paramecium Pond, kind of near the end of that path. So we're now in the Alexandra Botanic Garden. And one of the things that these gardens were used for by the botany department is the story is that they planted one of every kind of tree or shrub they could get their hands on, and they would grow outside in the garden, and then a second elsewhere on campus, so they could learn about them on, in the gardens, and then get tested on them in a different, a different individual somewhere else. So it was a quite dense collection of very diverse woodies. And then there were the student gardens, right, for Botany 101. Again, very hands-on, learning directly from the plants. What does it take to grow a giant sunflower, in New England? And so, not necessarily with aesthetics as the primary focus here, but a lot of learning. So again, this is distinct from the rest of campus where aesthetics and other functions are primary. Here, it really is that hands-on learning. These are student gardens within the Honeywell Arboretum. So the Alexandra Botanic Garden and the Honeywell Arboretum were part of those 24 acres that were set aside for educational use. This, we think, again, is Botany 101, or those introductory botany students, tending their individual plots, perhaps, but certainly learning, very hands-on. And I want you to keep this image in mind because I'm going to show you today's equivalent. So this area in the Honeywell Arboretum, those trees have all grown up, and there are additional plants have been added, and is much more of an arboretum and less of a student garden right now. But this need for hands-on, experiences for students, not just in greenhouse laboratories, but also in outdoor gardens, is being met in other ways within the Botanic Gardens now. And there was some amazing horticulture that happened over the years, right? This is a fairly famous, for those of you that were there in 1965, when the century plant grew through the roof and they removed a pane of glass from the desert house and let it keep going. I think it grew, many, many inches per day while it was, while this inflorescence was going, made the Boston Globe, etc. Harriet Crichton is the botany faculty member who really picked up where Margaret Ferguson left off. Harriet entered Wellesley in 1925, right when Margaret Ferguson had, established the greenhouses and the outdoor gardens, and written that article. So she's Wellesley class of 29. She went on to do a PhD at Cornell, working on genetics with Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for the jumping genes, and really both of them brought, real scientific chops to the study of botany at Wellesley. Not that, I mean, there were several other amazing botanists as well, just highlighting these two. Margaret Ferguson was the first woman president of the Botanical Society of America. These were very recognized botanical educators as well as botanists. And then Joe Jennings was the greenhouse guy, also with the outdoor gardens. We had fabulous horticulturalists, right, who were maintaining these plant collections and landscapes. Okay, Harriet gave a speech to the Botanical Society of America in the 1960s, early 1960s, when botany was starting to fade in popularity. And it was 1964 when botany and bacteriology merged with zoology and physiology to become what is now the biological sciences department. And there was this just general fear that botany was seen as this sort of dusty, isolated kind of study. She had a rallying cry: botanists of the world, unite and get going. Like, we needed to really emphasize the connections between the work of botanists and what the world needs, and that this is going to come back to Margaret Ferguson soon. And part of what was going on at the time is the Green Revolution, right? So this is where science, and in particular plant science, is going to really rise to the occasion and meet a huge societal need, right? There were all of these fears that we were not going to be able to feed ourselves with the rate the population was growing worldwide, and that the rate of agricultural production was not able to keep up. And it was plant breeders and geneticists like Norman Borlaug working on wheat, mostly in Mexico, and then Wan Ping working on rice in China. He's a superhero in China who just passed away last week at age 90. Um, they and their fellow plant geneticists really revolutionized yields, which was fantastic, right? Saved untold numbers of lives. And at the same time, there seemed to be I don't know if there's a consequence of that. And this is where I really am interested in your perceptions, especially around these times in the 60s and 70s, that, all right, we've got it figured out, right? We know how to grow plants as commodities. We know how to maximize their production. We just need to add fertilizers and water and then, breed them so that they're putting most of their resources into making the grain, right? If it's the wheat, or make them more drought tolerant if it's the rice. Um, right? We know how to do that. We have the tools. We're good, right? We just need a few specialists to keep working on this, but we got botany done. I, I think, and I've heard from some sources that that was the kind of conversation that was happening in colleges and universities, at least in the U.S. So in the 60s and 70s. What does Wellesley do? Well, in 1983, they reinvest in the greenhouses, right? So Harriet Crichton retired in 1974. But the biological sciences department um, always had a faculty member who was at least in name, the faculty advisor for the Botanic Gardens and the greenhouses. And it was right around this time, that the early 1980s, that the Friends of Horticulture, which have become the Friends of the Botanic Gardens, were founded. And the college reinvested in shoring up the greenhouses, which were in really tough shape at that time. So we lost that beautiful curved glass, but it was single paned curved glass, and the college recognized how much heat was being lost out of that single pane curved glass that was slipping in many places. And so we had this superstructure built over the previous structures. So you can really see the three finger laboratories, and then the tropical house in the middle there. Um, so they are shored up, right, restored. And I have to say, it was careful planning and budgeting by Margaret Ferguson and Harriet Crichton, endowed funds that can be spent only on seeds and soils or on plants, right? They really thought through what was it going to take to keep botany at Wellesley going. And I think that's what got us through this period where botany was in decline. And there was just a time of a lot of public engagement, right? We had docents, we still will have docents once we're open again to the public. We have school kids coming through, engaging with the plants. So it was, the Botanic Gardens really became an important public face of the college in many ways. It was also a time of a lot of art in the Botanic Gardens, and particularly in the greenhouses, including some very well-known artists like Michael Mazur, um, painting in the greenhouses in the 1970s in particular. Joel Janowitz and other folks would bring their students in. Here's some, you know, over the years, various kinds of art projects have happened in the greenhouses, from charcoals to the one on the right. Elle Friedberg was a double major in chemistry and studio art, and she figured out what kinds of materials she could print on that would hold up to being actually installed in the greenhouses. So lots of different kinds of sort of art and science combinations happening, but fewer botany classes, right? So we are a resource now. We're a resource mostly for the college as a public face, for art and for some science. And many of you probably remember Del Nickerson, who worked for decades in the Botanic Gardens, became the head horticulturist. he was a judge at the flower shows in Boston. He was just a fabulous horticulturalist, and I think still is in Maine, where he's retired. And he gave notice in 2000 that he would be retiring. And that sort of set off a bit of an existential crisis, because the restored greenhouses from the 1980s were really starting to fall apart. There were some issues with the way the restoration was done. They were much more, it was a much more sealed envelope, but it didn't breathe very well, and there was a lot of corrosion happening. Um, what should the college do, right? Should they reinvest in the greenhouses yet again? What might that look like? And what about these now 22 acres, because the Science Center had taken over a couple of acres from the Botanic Gardens? What to do? And so the college had an external visiting committee come and evaluate the existing botanical resources and give advice on what to do. And if you go back and you read Margaret Ferguson, she talks about things like how if we really understood photosynthesis, maybe we wouldn't be so worried about energy issues, right? So she really understood how studying plants could be applied in so many different ways back in 1925. And it is this sustainability push, that connection that has led to the reblossoming of the Botanic Gardens. And just for some context, just before that, in 1998, Michael van Valkenburg and Associates had completed the campus landscape master plan under Diana Chapman Walsh's leadership, and really rethought the campus, reducing the primacy of cars on campus and focusing more on reconnecting the landscape and how the landscape is functioning. And at just about the same time, the environmental studies program was founded. So before that, if you were interested in environmental issues, you had to create your own individual major. So there's a real, Wellesley was a little late to the game on this, but once Wellesley started investing in environmental things, as you'll see, over the next 20 years, we've really taken off. So how did this play out in the Botanic Gardens? One example, sorry, let me back up for one sec. One of the things that the visiting committee recommended was that this director position be created, right? And that's the role that I hold now and that I've held since 2005. It's a half faculty, half administrative role. So I've got a foot in each camp. I'm in the biology department and the ES program, and I'm also, managing the budget for the Botanic Gardens and setting priorities and wearing 1,000 hats, basically. But there's so much to do. And I'm bringing my ecology and systems thinking approach to what can we do with these outdoor gardens, and then how do we rethink the greenhouses? And one of the exciting things that we've developed over the last 12 years or so is an edible ecosystem teaching garden. And this is where I wanted you to think back to what those student gardens look like, and they were growing food in these sort of rectangular plots. We're thinking of this garden as an ecosystem. And that's already kind of a frame shift for a lot of people, is thinking about landscapes with the interventions that we're doing as a system, thinking about who are the other creatures that are living there, whether they're plants or animals or microbes, how are they interacting? If we want humans to be part of that, now we've got a garden, right? Humans are part of what this garden is supporting. And this is an edible garden, so we're going to be extracting from this garden. What does that mean for how we replace nutrients and all those sorts of things? So we're thinking of this wonderful and attractive garden as a place to do ecology, as well as a place to do horticulture and botany. And it attracts, these are folks from the Food Project in Boston. Anybody who's interested in growing food sustainably, there's lots of different models for how to do that. And the sort of forest gardening approach that this garden is an example of is something that a lot of people are interested in. And so they come to learn directly from it. And it's got this little outdoor classroom, a nice meeting space that's in high demand. So this is on the slope just below the observatory. I don't know if you can see how it's situated there, but here's another view. So now we're looking from the observatory across You can see there's a sort of, we call it the grandma oak here, one of those big white oaks that's probably almost 200 years old. And then Paramecium Pond and the academic quad would be off to the left of the picture. So we're looking down the slope. Those blue circles are the tips of these bottomless barrels. So those are our experimental plots. And then these students, there's something about this student's pose that, like, she could be back in those other photos from the 1930s, but she's looking at blueberries, and this is the horticulture class looking for signs of spring, looking for bud break, understanding the timing of that in relation to the weather. Um, and then on the right is some of our summer interns. They're measuring soil moisture under different kinds of ground covers. So this is a garden that lends itself to study, but also there are a lot of blueberries coming and strawberries and lots of, it's a diversity of food being produced in this garden, um, at the same time as it's providing these educational opportunities. And then a really exciting initiative just in the last, I guess, it's probably 5 to 7 years ago now. Um, Wendy Paulson, when asked how can we further sustainability on campus, she said, well, you know, your campus landscape is your best asset. You need to connect students to the biodiversity and the nature and the wonder of the outdoors, the space. And so we developed this initiative to connect students to the ecology of, and so ecology means the study of home, right? And the fact that this is a residential campus and the students can then study how their home landscape works, and it's on a different scale than probably their home landscapes from their other homes. Um, but everything from the students on the right are dropping dyes down into the drain and then seeing where the drains actually lead to, right? And this is the stormwater management system, because there are old maps of these underground systems and may or may not correspond to reality. And then on the left, the student is studying water quality in Paramecium Pond. And these are connected, right? How we handle water in this really hilly landscape has a lot of impact on the quality of the water. We have the wells very nearby, that is the campus drinking supply. Um, how, how do the characteristics of the landscape, how are they shaped by water, and how does water shape them in turn? Excuse me. So lots of hands-on opportunities for students to engage, both through formal study, these are summer research students, and also through citizen science kinds of opportunities. And we've embarked on a project for Science Hill in particular. So this is an area, it's a little hard to see with all these arrows, but the Science Center is in the middle here, and there's just a lot of topography around the Science Center. There's a parking lot here to the right. Right now, there's temporary classrooms there because the Science Center has been under construction for a couple of years. Those trailers will go away. Sorry, those modular classrooms will go away at the end of 2021. We are on schedule for this and we're super excited. And we will be replacing that parking lot. And as you can see, these arrows show how water flows over the surface. This is from a hydrological analysis. And you can see that many of them lead down Water Tower Hill towards Gray Lot. If Gray Lot could help manage that stormwater, we would obviate the need for other kinds of interventions. Um, there's a need for water in the landscape, right? For Paramecium Pond, for example. We have these wet meadows in front of the Science Center. The mantra for stormwater management is to slow water down and keep it local. And that's what will help all of our trees with climate change, right? That the trend is that we are getting fewer rainstorms and more intense rainstorms, like may or may not be happening momentarily here. Um, and we need for that rain to not just flow fast over the surface, which is when it causes problems, we need for it to infiltrate into the soil. And we may need to do interventions to help it do that. And that will enable the trees to then take it up, and then you don't have to worry about it downstream, right? We need that water to infiltrate. So what kinds of interventions are needed to make that happen? And this is another exciting thing that off of Route 135 up here with this big yellow arrow, there's a lot of water that can come off of Route 135 currently going into drains, right? And right out to Lake Waban with whatever stuff they've accumulated on the road. What if we could capture that and use it, filter it and use it to feed Paramecium Pond rather than pumping water up the hill and down that cascade, et cetera. So we're looking for ways to manage water more sustainably given climate change, right? So we're improving the resilience of the campus landscape um, by thinking about water as a system and how we want to use it in the landscape and how we manage when it does come more intensively and less frequently than it has in the past. So these are the kinds of things where this whole landscape as a system is of immense educational value, as long as we're not hiding how things work, right? We're not just paving, hiding the pipes underground and making it beautiful on top. This is the educational part, right? This is where we're daylighting how things work so that we can study them. Doesn't mean there's pipes running above ground. It means let's, you know, put a little water bar and that we'll see how water infiltrates there and does it feed that tree right next to it. What are what are the conditions that the landscape needs and how can we make the natural rainfall meet those needs? Really big project. And we've got students who are just happy to jump in the pond, right, and study who's there. There's a ton of frog um, tadpoles in there right now. In the spring, it is loud. Spring peepers and wood frogs, and the students notice on their way to class that wow, it just got loud over there. What's going on? And the students who've had the privilege of studying it over the summer, they feel that really strong connection. They can explain to their colleagues, there's frogs in there, and here's who they are. And, right? They really get to know it. Okay, sorry, I'm talking fast. Back to the greenhouses. Almost done. This is 2017. They were really in tough shape. We were to the point where if there were winds over 30 miles an hour, we couldn't be in there. It was just not safe. And these lights that were, state of the art in the 1920s were no longer state of the art. And so the reinvestment was not to rebuild the existing greenhouses, but to completely rethink how can we create climate bubbles basically on the landscape that would meet those same goals that Margaret Ferguson had set out. So laboratories under glass that connect to the science building, and then the opportunity to grow plants from around the world for the public and for study. So this is a very recent picture overview, and I'll just try to point out the various greenhouse pieces. So I think you can see Galen Stone Tower peeking up above the horizon there. So the L wing part of the Science Center is facing Galen Stone Tower. The E wing with the metal facade is here, kind of facing us. And Sage is gone, right? This is except for the wall that faces the focus, which has been preserved. I can't wait to see it from the inside. And then the new building is taking shape, not in Sage's footprint, but connected to the rest of the Science Center in a new shape. And then pretty much where the greenhouses were, we have a series of greenhouses. So we have circled here, this is the old Botany Annex that had moved around. It had been attached to Dower when it was built in 1907. And it got moved to the Margaret Ferguson greenhouses sometime after they were built. And then we moved it out of harm's way because it's this cute little greenhouse we restored it for its 100th birthday in 2007. And now it's sort of our nod to history. And it was the first greenhouse built for research purposes at Wellesley. So that's the Botany Annex. This is Global Flora. It follows the track of the sun. So it's from the southeast to the southwest. The curve of the greenhouse follows the sun, and it also follows the arc of the hillside that it's on. That little standalone bump, again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, that's where the Durant camellia is, right? So the camellia was in the old greenhouses, and that was the one tree that we couldn't move. It was owned by the founders of the college. It's over 100 years old. It had been in the ground for almost 100 years. We were given less than 50% chance of survival if we tried to move it. We have very few things remaining from the Durants, partly because of the 1914 fire. We had to save the camellia. So we took down the greenhouses around it. We It looked like it had a lunar landing module built around it to protect it during construction. And then it got its own little pavilion, which I'll show you in a minute. And then the rest of the collection, the dry biome and then the wet biome, is in this very innovative space. And then the fingers, right, those laboratories under glass, they're going up right now. These are just their skeletons, and they're connected into the entrance here to the new building, right? So we'll be connected right into the horticulture lab, um, similar to the old greenhouses. And in these houses, we will have those lights that enable us to do 3 generations or however many generations of Arabidopsis or whatever the plant models are that students are studying. So we'll really be able to manipulate conditions within these research greenhouses. Whereas the global flora bubble, we're just trying to keep it like North Carolina in New England year round. And that's what global flora looks like on the inside, right? So this is in the wet biome. We've got a mangrove tank. We've got plants that are not adapted to drought, right? So the wet biome is not all aquatic habitats. It's really a somewhat similar to the tropic house in the kinds of plants that it supports. There's a lot more information on global flora in a slideshow that Gail Kahn put together for the reunion materials. So if you want to see a lot more images and stories of its being built and all that sort of thing, I would refer you to that. And similarly, the Paulson Ecology of Place Initiative has a wonderful website that I recommend if you want to hear more about that. And the entry into global flora is celebrating our connection with art. So we have on the left, this is a project that Gail and I worked on quite a lot. These are paper mache flowers from the late 1800s in France that the Durants brought back from the Paris Exposition of 1878. They come apart. You can see their internal, how the flowers are put together. They're much bigger than life size. These were used in teaching for decades, and I still use them to illustrate diversity of floral form. But we had them restored and arranged in a way that we call it the botanist bouquet. They're not these perfect flowers, right? Because the petals come off and etc. But they're educational and beautiful, and that's kind of our theme, right? We're trying to combine beauty, educational value, and sustainability in this one space. And we're trying to visualize what's happening underground in global flora as well. So we have sensors in the soil and that can detect various different things. So we're working, one of the big goals is to be able to interpret what's happening in these indoor ecosystems. And, artists can help us do that at least as well as scientists can. So we're really looking forward to being fully open to the campus community and then subsequently to the public, and engaging a whole range of students in just getting to know these plants, these indoor environments, and what's happening. We're also trying to make connections to these plants, right? So connections more than collections, I would say. We really want our botanic gardens to be a resource for all of our students. We want the students from China to connect to the plants from China. For example, I mean the color coding on these are our sort of draft labels for global flora. Orange means came from Africa. Pink means it came from Asia. It was just continents. But then the names that we put on these plants, we're working on a plan so that those names reflect what those plants are called in the areas where they're from. So again, building in the stories, because those names often contain stories. So building those connections this kurub, which is an amazing, this witch is an amazing plant. Ours is now coning. It is making little cones, and we know it's a female, right? So you need to get to know. There's so many plants that can be overwhelming, but if we can draw attention and start developing the stories of all these plants, then we're developing the kinds of connections that we need so that we have more of a reciprocal relationship um, with the diversity of species. And that's what the Durant Camellia looks like in its little pavilion. Um, really quite a special space. It's meant to be a space of calm. It is a Japanese tree. It would be happiest on the coast of Japan, probably, but we're trying to replicate those conditions in its pavilion. Um, I just want to say thank you to Gail for helping me with all the images and the history and just trying to understand all the context. Kathy Suma is the director of the Science Center, class of '83, has been my partner through this journey for most of it, and yeah, just helping understand what the possibilities are for the Botanic Gardens. And thank you also to the college archives for being such a wonderful resource for this work. So that's, I would just do a quick recap of the massive flow of words I've just thrown at you. Um, just the arc of the story, right? So 1920s, we had this big investment in botany that Margaret Ferguson put forward the vision for, raised the money, was cognizant not only of the value of the science, but also the humanistic value of just having these gardens and these greenhouses, building on the Durant's vision. Um, the 1930s and maybe into the 40s, Depression and World War II, probably pragmatism comes into that as well, and a lot of the hands-on learning from plants and self-reliance. 50s through the 70s, science and technology are starting to solve the world's problems, um, but perhaps botany then starts fading as we think we've figured out how plants work. Not so simple, perhaps. 80s and 90s, we're moving forward with horticulture and art, and sort of becoming more of a public resource. And then in the 2000s through now, reinvestment with especially the lens of sustainability. We now have the Frost Center for the Environment, which is an exciting, amazingly exciting part of the new Science Center, but it's really a college-wide resource as well. The Paulson Initiative. We have a strategic plan that focuses on inclusive excellence and thinking about how the Botanic Gardens can serve those goals and really become a center that could be of interest to all, right? So going back to again to Margaret Ferguson's vision, really just recognizing that humans manage so much land, often not very intentionally. Um, Often not thinking much about the other species that are sharing those spaces. Um, and there's just huge opportunities for improvement in how we manage those spaces, whether they're, well-tended gardens or abandoned lots. Like there's just so many opportunities for improvement. If you think of them as systems and how they connect to everything from human health to environmental health. So there are also, of course, many, many people with deep connections to plants that go way beyond what Western science accommodates now. Um, there's so much to learn for us to become better stewards of the land that we are tending one way or another. Um, and how do we take advantage of the campus landscape that we have to study it and to become um, to have a closer relationship to this landscape that these students call home for 4 years, and the rest of us that have the opportunity to stay here for longer can really form these deep understandings with and work on adaptive management, getting better and better over time and how we manage these resources. And I just wanted to point out, I have one more little slide. In that circle is outdoor camellia, right? This is a hardy camellia donated by the Business Leadership Council just a couple of years ago, planted outdoors as a contrast to this 150-year-old camellia in its own pavilion, its own bubble. Here's one, doesn't need a bubble. The variety name is actually Survivor. And there it is outdoors, goes through the winter just fine. It's actually a little bigger. This photo was taken last year. So we're really trying to provide every kind of opportunity, for inspiration, and to learn directly from plants. So I think I've talked quite enough. And at this point, I would really like to hear if you took botany at Wellesley in any of those eras or otherwise engaged, with any of the resources that we have here. And you can either correct me or add new dimensions or otherwise improve this story. We'd love to hear from you now, or by email. I have my email address here. It's kjones@wellesley.edu. We're just at the beginning, as I said, of putting together this retrospective of 100 years of botanic gardens at Wellesley. And please help us improve this story. Thank you very, very much.
We have a question that popped up in the chat, Kristina. I was hoping you could answer. It's from Chris Dittmeyer. She says, can you explain a bit more the blue bottomless pits in the photo of the edible ecosystem?
Sure. So the idea was the edible ecosystem garden itself. I can maybe go back to the images, maybe without making you nauseous. There we go. So these blue, we call them the barrels. They're in the context, we wanted to be able to do experiments in this garden, but there wasn't enough room. It's about 1/3 of an acre to really do replicates, right, of different things in different places, to do a well-designed experiment, unless they were sort of small scale. But we worried that anything small scale would get swallowed up. I mean, you should see this garden now. Those blueberries are huge. They're half highs. These fruit trees are big. Their understories have gotten big. It would be very hard to do an experiment with spinach, say, right, or something that's a short-term experiment and not have it get swallowed up by the rest of the garden. So these barrels are almost like these inserts into the garden where we can manipulate the soil chemistry, for example, and without impacting the rest of the garden. And there's 24 of them, which divides neatly into 3s or 4s. So depending on what variables we want to manipulate, we can have replicates. So there've been a couple of different student theses, looking at, I think that one was on spinach growing with and without a legume cover crop, for example, right? So there are opportunities to do experiments, really, in the context of an outdoor food garden with all of the things that come with that, but without too much influence from the outside garden itself. So yeah, I don't know if maybe that answers the question. They're like giant pots that are buried.
That's great. We have another question in the chat from Queta Carter Bond. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. We see water as one resource that will be in demand as the world heats. Is there some focus on plants that are sparing of water?
That are sparing of water.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I didn't have a good photo of the dry biome in Global Flora, but 1/3 of that big whoosh shape is focused on plants that are drought tolerant or drought avoiding. They have a huge diversity of adaptations for dealing with scarcity of water. So that's a real focus for that area. In the outdoor gardens, it's mostly about topography, right? So things that are in the meadows, in the lowlands, mostly don't need to be drought tolerant, at least not yet. But we have really sharp drainage, right? We have pretty sandy soils. So with the combination of that and steep slopes means that if there's not fairly frequent rain in the growing season, we really see it, right? We see trees turning colors earlier in the fall if it's been a really dry August, for example, right? So the growing season actually gets shortened by drought for some of our even New England native trees. We're seeing those effects now. So it's a something that we need to think about as we're redeveloping our ideas for Science Hill and rethinking how we're kind of redirecting water. So are we are we just enhancing the ability of the soil to infiltrate, or are we also replacing things that are dying with things that are more drought tolerant? You know, I think it's going to have to be a combination of those things. We haven't moved too much in that direction yet. We have no permanent irrigation in the outdoor gardens unless you count the little stream, which is an artificial stream. And there's definitely some trees that are tapped into that as their irrigation. But otherwise, the established trees and shrubs are on their own with respect to water. We have a little golf cart with a big barrel that we can water things that we've just planted through until they get established. But yeah, drought tolerance is a thing we're going to be more and more focused on, even here in New England.
Thank you. There's a couple more questions. I want to encourage people to actually raise their hands, right? The Zoom hand. I think Kristina would love to have you just speak to her, but I'm happy to read anybody's question from the chat. Jennifer asks, how were the student garden projects impacted by COVID?
Well, we had no one on campus last summer, right? So that was a challenge. We pretty much hit pause for a year. We had the Paulson initiative was incredibly creative and developed. They called it the Paulson Place Challenge. We had 14 students, each of whom started analyzing tree canopy cover in their local area, wherever they were around. They were all in the US. And learning how to do GIS mapping and the relationships between canopy cover and air quality, right? So there were ways that we got students to engage with the landscapes around them, even though they weren't able to be on campus. But that was a stretch. That was really, I will say, that was more educational without that reciprocal, you know, what the students learn helps us improve our management. We missed that link over the past year. But this year we've been able, this academic year, when we've had on average half students on campus at any one time, we've had an overwhelming, I mean, we've had 19 work study students, and they've been so grateful to have in-person hands-on learning opportunities and jobs. And we've made really great progress on a lot of our priorities with them this year. And starting Monday, we have our summer internship program on campus with 8 students. So really looking forward to that. Should I stop sharing my screen perhaps so that we can see each other better?
Each other better. That's a good idea.
Okay. All right.
All right. I have one more I'd like to read. Maybe we could, like, after I read the next one, switch between things that have been typed in the chat and people who have their hands raised. Nan Kahane asks, what role does botany play in the environmental studies program?
Where do I start? Let's see. Everything from a first-year seminar on food, agriculture, and the environment that used the edible ecosystem and these little planter boxes that we called Farm in a Box. I can't tell you how many students come in so excited to save the world through sustainable agriculture, but they don't have the understanding of how soils work, or the, you know, just they need some understanding. It's not necessarily a scientific understanding, but hands-on understanding of how plants work and how the soils and the other creatures that are living there too impact your ability to grow food, for example. So it's mostly been through that food lens so far, but then in the last couple of years also through an environmental health, right? So the air filtration, water filtration, what are the connections between healthy landscapes and those kinds of issues, and with more and more of a focus on justice and equity. So the mapping skills, the GIS, those are tools that the students are really gaining now, both through hands-on work in the Botanic Gardens, but also through coursework in the ES. So I think those are the main connections.
It's a very impressive presentation throughout. Thanks a lot.
I believe Ileana has had her hand raised for a little while. Do you want to say something, please?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Kristina. You may remember me. I gave an Al Gore climate talk in your class quite a few years ago.
You bet.
I put a question. I didn't realize I was going to be able to speak directly, so I put something in the chat. I have really two sort of issues I'm curious about. I am very excited about everything you are doing, you and Wellesley are doing right now. I'm curious whether the students are exposed to the ideas of regenerative agriculture. And it's such a hopeful worldwide movement that where so much about climate change can be so depressing, that there are so many wonderful success stories. And I particularly, I wrote this on my page, reunion page, but I would hope that everyone would watch Kiss the Ground on Netflix. And particularly to the very end, because the ecosystem that's been restored in China through regenerative agriculture is just, it's like a miracle. Mm-hmm. So that's one question I have. And the other question I have is, are they also being exposed to Douglas Tallamy? And for instance, particularly his most accessible recent book, Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. And it seems to me this is an excellent way to bring that to this large group and spread the word. So I'm just curious about those two.
Yeah, two great questions. I'll try to keep my responses short because there's a lot to say. Regenerative agriculture, absolutely, right? You bring the soil back to life. And the name of the firm that worked on the design of the edible ecosystem garden with me for several years is Regenerative Design Group. They are permaculture, you know, is what they would call their approach, I think, but they go beyond permaculture in many ways. It is science-based. It is really about how do you keep improving the soil rather than reducing the ability of the soil to support plants over time. And that's a big part of that regeneration, right? And understanding, like I've said, what other critters are living in the soil. Are they mostly pests, right? All they have to eat is plant roots. And so you constantly have to do battle with the other creatures in the soil. Or do you have a really healthy biodiverse ecosystem underground and above ground where you've got the predators in place and you've got the microbes that are, you know, coating the roots and having beneficial relationships for the most part with the plants, and they're able to help ward off diseases. It's such a complex system, but there's pretty straightforward ways to support that complexity in ways that supports the plants, right? And enables you to get what you need from them. And there's lots and lots of good examples now. And we're trying to develop the edible ecosystem as a better and better example of that. Yeah. And then for Doug Tallamy, so his main messages about, you know, plant native plants because they support native insects, which is what birds eat, et cetera. Like you're supporting the whole system that way. I think is generally sound. I'm not a huge fan of some of aspects of his message. He really, there's a lot of controversy about the whole concept of a native, right? A native at what point in time and what's the scale that we're talking about, especially with climate change and plants moving, lots of species moving around. And I think he's softened up a bit, but he was fairly dogmatic, right, about what he defined as native, and has been somewhat dismissive of what I consider important nuance on this topic. So he's not a speaker that I would bring to campus. I've used some examples that he's shared, and I think his message overall is valuable. But anyway, that's my take on Doug Tallamy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah,
see Stevens. Sorry to jump in, Gail, but I can see the participants now.
I know, isn't it fun? We have another message in the chat from Nancy Felton-Elkins. Are we using any chemicals in the greenhouses and gardens?
Almost none. Our first line of defense is biological, right? We are spending too much money right now on buying in beneficial insects, right? The predators we need to identify who are the pests that we have. And then yeah, hoping that they find the you know, the appropriate predator. They're not always on the market at the right time, et cetera. But we're bringing a real IPM, right, integrative pest management approach. Um, we have not said no to chemicals as a sort of a last ditch and very targeted opportunity to knock back pests so that then your beneficials can be effective. Um, but our chemical use is very, very low.
But deer and rabbits don't bother you?
I chased a deer out of the arboretum yesterday. They, you know, we don't plant as many viburnums as we would if we didn't have deer. They're definitely an issue. They impact what we can grow. We have a lot of rabbits, and honestly, right now with the blueberries, the robins get the blueberries before they're fully ripe, which is enough to just drive you insane. We've learned that well, we're going to try multiple things this summer because we have a bumper crop coming. Apparently, grape Kool-Aid. You can spray grape Kool-Aid on your ripening blueberries, and the birds don't like it. And you can wash it off if you don't like the taste. So that's a UMass extension thing to try. We tried it at a small scale 2 years ago and it seemed to work.
Lion poo apparently really keeps everything away.
Coyote poo does too.
Keep me away too. That's the challenge, right? We don't want to fence off this garden in any way. We want students to be able to come through, and we don't want them to be turned off. We've tried, you know, this horrible smelling deer repellent that you can soak a tennis ball in and then put that on a stake. And, you know, that works on a small scale. We've tried a lot of things, and we'll continue to try. But in the meantime, we're sharing our harvest with other critters.
Thanks. Laura, you've had your hand raised.
Hi, thanks, Gail. Hi, Kristina. Thanks for that really excellent talk. I moved countries in October, and this spring I realized that in my neighborhood, in one of the gardens, there's a winter hardy camellia tree, and it's been blooming. So that was seeing that, it reminded me of the Durant's camellia, and just that was an excellent way to have a first spring in a new country. And so I was really excited to see the photo of the sensors in the beds of global flora. And I was wondering what the sensors are measuring, and if you're thinking about doing any forcing experiments there, or just kind of passively trying to understand routine watering practices within the greenhouses or temperature changes.
Yeah, we're just getting started. I mean, Jen Yang has been, you know, class of 2012 is back as a botany fellow, right? Postdoctoral botany fellow after doing her PhD studying roots. And she's really helped develop that underground sensor network. We have, you know, of course, you can put different kinds of probes and into these data loggers. So we have a lot of flexibility, and, you know, COVID really put the kibosh on further development of that over the past year. But we're excited to use it for a whole range of things. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, and we're really just starting to figure it out. But a lot of it is that we just want to understand what is this climate bubble that we've created. You know, so we've come a long ways from the old greenhouses where we mechanically open the vents, you know, and close them as needed. We now have a very fancy and sophisticated software, you know.
Lisa, could you do me a favor and bring the tray from downstairs?
That, you know, senses the air temperature, humidity, things like that, wind speed, you know, closes the vents if the winds are going to blow them off, you know, that kind of thing. So it's all automated. So we have a lot of data on the above ground conditions, and this is an attempt to begin to see what's happening with underground conditions. So far it's mostly been things like soil moisture and soil temperature, but you know, we have the mangrove tank, and then we have a freshwater tank, the paludarium as we call it, and we can be measuring things, you know, like pH or dissolved oxygen, right, on an ongoing basis with a data logger, so that if we have an issue, we can trace it back. Right now, it's mostly informing our management of the spaces, but we fully anticipate that they'll be used for experiments and manipulations. We just don't know what those would be yet.
Very cool. Thanks so much.
Question?
Yeah, Lulu's been eager to ask her question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks so much, Kristina. It's really been so interesting to hear your update. I have a couple of questions, and two questions are within the area of how we are learning to deal with restricted resources in our agricultural planning. And I wondered if we have tried to work with the development of shorter life cycle plants and crops. Obviously, with the variability in the weather around the world, planting cycles are shortened. So one was that, and related to that is what we're doing with aquaculture. I understand there's some studies in aquaculture on campus. So, and then lastly, what kind of work are we doing on the medicinal value of plants? Because there's just centuries of data there. And if we are experimenting with different kinds of plants, have we done some studies in that area?
Okay, you are anticipating many of the ways that we are planning to go, but haven't fully been able to go yet. I think you said aquaculture. Is that, yeah. We have had some in the old greenhouses. We have had some students who experimented with aquaponics. Right, we had some I think it was tilapia. You know, in the fish tank below, and you cycle the water up into a bed that had basil growing in it, and the fertilizer is the fish poop, right? And the plants are cleansing the water, and it's cleaner as it goes back down into the fish. And those are really, really interesting systems, right? They're microcosms of systems that are relatively easy to study. And I'm hoping we are able to set up things like that in the new teaching and research greenhouses that are yet to be built.
And hydroponics is a part of this, right?
Yes. So it's just a question whether you include animals like fish, right? I think it's hydroponics if you've just
Plants.
Less biological and more chemical system, but very, very good for water conservation and very precision, for use of resources, as you were saying, especially if you wanted to grow lettuces and things like that in urban areas. Those are really, really promising ways to do that. And we've experimented with these little wall pocket systems in the past in the greenhouses to do some things along those lines. There were issues with it, maybe because in the past we were always on the campus well water, which is pretty salty. And now we are collecting rainwater. Like, we have these two giant cisterns underground, which is where all the water for the greenhouses is coming from now. But that's really exciting that we have now better quality water that we can experiment with. And I think some of these kinds of things that you're talking about, we have better opportunities to work on them. They're not in our immediate plans, but I know student interest is going to drive us in those directions. Same with medicinal plants. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Deborah, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And this has been a wonderful program. Thank you very much. I was wondering if there are attempts to study the invasive plants that come into the botanical garden as people are raising the sustainable food, et cetera. And there are exotic plants that come into my garden, and perhaps they also impact your gardens there.
Absolutely. I mean, there are several species on campus that are, not only from other continents, but very aggressive. And so they crowd out other species and reduce the overall diversity of an area. And we have a new gardens horticulturist, Trisha Diggins, who had been working in the outdoor gardens for 30 something years, has moved on, and we hired Ann Beckley. She started just under a year ago, and she brings some GIS skills, mapping skills. She's going to have, we were just talking about, the summer program that starts on Monday. She's going to have students mapping where these plants are. So tracking them in the gardens and tracking their expansions or contractions. And we may be doing experiments, like in some areas, we've tried this technique to reduce their spread. In other areas, we try this one. And so we'll have really these tools that will help us understand how they're moving and what kinds of impacts they're having. You know, there are many species that are aggressive, but aren't otherwise a problem, right? So we're really interested in the community dynamics in these gardens, right? We don't have a planting plan that we're trying to manage, sort of a static thing, right? So very formal gardens, you may have a very precise plan, and the management is then more intensive to try to keep it looking that way. We're very much working with natural processes like succession, right? And editing out the things that are either poorly placed because they were planted by squirrels, you know, or something like that, or they're just a plant that we don't see the use for right now and we don't want it there. So it's an editing process, but then seeing how those communities are changing over time, and these mapping tools are going to really help us understand that at a bigger scale than what we've been able to do in the past.
Thank you.
I would like,
Go on.
I would really love to hear from any of you who want to share some of your experiences and honestly really correct any misunderstandings that you heard from me, or you know, just setting the context for some of the things that like in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I don't have much understanding of what was happening then with botany at Wellesley, especially once Harriet retired. Right. I mean, she stayed involved. She was involved with the 1998 campus master planning at age 80 something. You know, she was so dedicated. And I did meet her, you know, when I started at Wellesley in the mid 90s. But we don't have nearly as good records for, you know, what were the goals and priorities for the gardens through those times. So I just love to hear what your experiences are and what you found meaningful whenever you were at Wellesley. Anyone wants to share that?
Oh, I took a class at Wellesley in 1959. Nobody knew the name of it. And I knew because I had studied Greek at Wellesley, but it was called ecology. And it was under the Department of Zoology. And it was taught by Miss McCosh, I think. And I gave my papers recently to my granddaughter, but I'll see if I can get them back. And if I can get them back, I'll send them to you. But we studied Paramecium Pond, and we did a lot of drawing of what we found there, and it was very wonderful. So it's exciting 60 years later to see that you're continuing what was started by Margaret Ferguson and then continued onward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very helpful to hear.
Hi, I had the opportunity to take your sustainable horticulture as an audit many years ago, which is wonderful. So I'm wondering if you're still teaching that class.
Absolutely. That class happens every year.
Okay, so there's only, I think, 90 people on this, but if anybody wants to try to audit it, that was just great. And I also saw the Kiss the Ground movie, but there's another movie called Symphony of the Soil that comes at a different angle, but it's also really good if people are interested in that topic.
Thank you, Amy. Let's see, Ileana. You're muted.
Rosalie had asked about a little while ago, is there a connection between botany and art at Wellesley?
What would you say to that, Gail? Sorry to put you on the spot, but you've been more involved.
That's a good one. I think that, you know, in the true spirit of liberal arts, that there you know, there is a connection. There has always been a connection, sometimes more tenuous than others. I recall that Susan Hallowell, our first botany professor, had her students study art so that they could more accurately portray plants and therefore learn them better. And you've done that as well in 108. You make your students draw plants. I don't know how much it goes the other direction because we're not as involved with the arts faculty, but that accurate representation, it comes through in the art classes that we see.
Yeah, that's right. And I would add, I didn't have a good photo of the link, as we call it, the sort of entryway into the Global Flora greenhouse has an amazing mural by David Tang Olson in the studio art department that he developed together with his digital design class. And I went to the class and told them what we were trying to do of basically warm people up to the idea that they were going to be met with an overwhelming diversity of plants, and it kind of warm up their eyes. And they had all kinds of ideas for plant portraits and how do you get people to look at plants as individuals instead of this green blur, right? And so having artists think about that, like that's what we got on the wall was how David and his students wanted to introduce diversity of plant form. So that's a wonderful one. And the other thing that we have is a quite new fellowship in creative interpretation in Global Flora, in honor of Suzanne Kibler-Morris. And that was that example of the chemistry and studio art major who did those prints on a fabric that she found would be able to handle the greenhouse conditions. So we love doing site-specific art projects, and sometimes they show up unbeknownst to those of us trying to maintain the spaces. But we want to be more than just an inspiration for art. Like we want it to go both ways, and many of the studio art faculty are really receptive to that. And I think once we are fully open again with the Science Center construction, we've been really, it's hard to get here, right? I anticipate stronger and stronger connections.
Peggy, you've had your hand raised for a while.
Thank you. I'm in the class of 61, and in those days I am very embarrassed to say that I paid absolutely no attention to botany, and it wasn't something that presented to me as something of interest. And I am blown away by your presentation, and I can tell from others' comments, we're really jealous that Wellesley is providing this now. And do you have any consideration of creating programs for former Wellesley grads to come and study botany with you? Is that an idea you've thought about?
So one of the things that I think of the Frost Center for the Environment as sort of an umbrella for connections to alumni. We had a program for a few years we called Project Handprint. It was about improving your positive environmental impact as opposed to your footprint. And we reached out to alumni, and we had a lot of engagement with alumni in some of our programs. And the connections between current students and young alums engaging with really established alums in the field was a big mutual benefit. And so it was almost like this test case that then we would love to build on. It's on the list of things to do. I think most appropriately through the Center for the Environment, which we are an important part of. So not necessarily botany specific. I feel like we've been in this blur, honestly, of the last couple of years of construction, and the Science Hill is just a disaster zone of construction right now, and we need to stitch together back the landscapes. And I feel like we need to get our house in order, and then we can think about, then we build into it the students and the coursework and the research opportunities, and then we can start thinking beyond that, right? But absolutely, I mean, alumni, we love to engage alumni, and right now it's mostly through the Friends of the Botanic Gardens, right? We do have some offerings, whether it's botanical art or horticulture seminars. We do have some webinars I'm seeing in the chat. But yeah, we're developing that programming. It's just our small staff is pretty overwhelmed right now. It's hard to make that a priority. But yeah, we are we're definitely interested in engaging with alums and making sure that that opportunity goes both directions, because we have a lot to learn from you. Okay, we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, Abigail?
Hi. So I know you had asked for some people to share some of their experiences with the botany program at Wellesley, and I was an art and an art history student, but I took this class my senior year that was food and food culture in medieval and Renaissance Italy, and that we did a really cool thing with the botany department where we each got to grow our own medieval ingredient, and then we had to cook an authentic medieval or Renaissance recipe with it. I had horseradish, I still remember it, and the dish was not to a modern palate, but I had never really been interested in gardening or botany before. But I mean, that course actually really got me interested in a lot of, I mean, now I'm a history teacher. I teach ancient through medieval history, and I get to use some of that knowledge from that class. And I worked in hospitality for 12 years. So it was like all like my different interests kind of like were able to like really grow in that one class. So I don't have a lot of experience with the botany department, but if I could go back to school, if I could go back and take classes again, I would most certainly do it, because it was a very, very cool experience.
I actually team taught that course with Jackie Masacchio one year, because we brought more of the botany in, and we used the kitchen garden. It took us a long time to get that horseradish out, because it was very persistent. But yes, I'm so glad to hear that that had that kind of impact. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Catherine, you've had your hand raised.
This is not a question as much as a comment. When I was on the alumni board in the 1970s, one of our privileges was to go around to the different classes who were having reunions. And when we went to the class, I don't remember exactly which one it was, but it was a class that graduated in the teens, 19 teens. And these two women who were, well, comfortably in their 90s came up, and one of them said to the other, "I don't remember your name, but I knew you from the War Garden." And I had never heard the phrase war garden before, but they explained that because of the war, some students stayed on campus and grew food, which was then canned to be used the following year. And I've always thought that that was pretty interesting.
Absolutely. Apparently the farmerettes were remarkably productive with their food growing, and really were impactful with that. It wasn't just a learning opportunity. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you for your interesting talk.
You bet. So I would like to encourage anyone who hasn't had a chance to share to email me. Again, it's kjones@wellesley.edu. And yes, this talk, this whole thing has been recorded, I hope, and can be shared. And thank you for posting that in the chat. And we're just starting to build this story, right? So we would love it to be more complete, and to really gain an understanding of where we've been, and really excited about where we're going. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your reunion.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you for being thank you for being a very special guest for the class of 1961. I'm glad we could share it. It was terrific.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Kristina. Great.